All right. I presume one of you can tell me everything. You can see my screen, right?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. See. Well, thank you for those who were able to join us for this webinar in a very weird period. First of all, because COVID, fortunately, is still around the corner, and we're hoping everyone is safe and doing well. And second, it's always slower and quieter between Christmas and year end, but it's also a time to reflect about the year and decide what needs to be done for the upcoming fiscal year. This webinar intends to address two main topics. First, a reminder of what you need to know regarding the tax system and how do you prepare for your tax compliance requirements. And then also the second part will be what are the tax tips out there available for French tax resident or international folks having an involvement with France. Um, and we could talk certainly for hours about it, but I try to limit myself to the next 30 or 40 minutes, and then perhaps if you guys have questions, I know some of you have already sent me questions at the beginning of this session, or if you have more, feel free to send those at the end. I would ask you please to put your mic in off mode for the duration of my presentation. And then once I'll be done, I will certainly let you interact and ask me all the questions you may have. Okay. So with no further ado, let's start with a disclaimer. I think everybody knows that those information we're providing to you are for free, but with limitations to certain cases where your personal case might be different than the general case of everyone. So make sure you keep that in mind. The agenda for today. So we're going to, as I said, cover the basic reminders about your taxes, how the taxes work in France, the portal, tax portal access, which for me is one of the most critical items to have, especially nowadays where with COVID, it's hard to go physically to an office, and we want to make sure that you have access online to communicate with your tax authorities. The tax tips I was saying, and the personal finances as well, tips and the Q&A. About me, about us at Monceau CPA, I'm a partner, managing partner here at Monceau CPA, which I founded a couple of years ago. We serve the international community, given that my background and license in three main countries, France, US, and Canada. But we have clients all over the world, and we have partnership with accountants everywhere. And we mainly serve those countries, the UK, Australia, and other international countries. As you can see, my background, I'm from France, but graduated in the US, and happens to have had many years in large accounting firms and large companies. And for the little stories to add it, certified sworn in translator, also US Notary Public, and deputy mayor of a town next to Paris. That is about me. And hopefully I will guide you through the next slide. So I have here isolated and highlighted the main things that I believe I see the common mistakes as part of the international community when we talk about French taxes. As I said, this is first a reminder of the main things you need to know about taxes. One of the main elements that a lot of people get it wrong is the fiscal residency. So some people have arrived in France due to the work, the Brexit Accord. Some have come here on a talent visa. Some have come on a spouse visa. Some have come on a tourist long-term, long-stay visa. You have to understand immigration and taxes are not necessarily the best friends, but one is related to the other. Please make sure to put your mic in mute. That would be great for everyone. So just very important reminder that the main thing you need to understand in taxes, especially in France, is I'm a fiscal resident. And a lot of people just sums up that component by saying, have I stayed in France more than 183 days? And that's it. Yes and no. That is one of the criteria, right? But it's more like the majority of the year. So I've had many clients in retirement, for example, traveling around the world. Well, with COVID, it's complicated, but at least if that's the case, you just know that it's not the 183 days, it's the majority of the days of the year. But that's for the first criteria. The other criteria are listed there, right? So if your family is here, your spouse is here, your kids are in school, you basically decided that your home is now called France, even though you kept an apartment in California or in New York, you are primary fiscally resident of France. Even if your visa does not allow you to work, but you've been here long enough to match any of those requirements, you are indeed a French fiscal resident. So it's very important to keep that in mind because you are then liable to submit a French tax return. Okay, so that's the clear definition of the Article 4B of the tax law. I invite you to look at it if you have some free time. But here I've summarized the main 6 points that makes you a fiscal resident. Now, I just want to point it out that if you moved during 2021, then obviously France will only look at from the date you became a French tax resident to tax you, okay? So if you arrived in France September 1st, so if you got your visa on October 1st, then we will only look at moving forward after October 1st date. Anything prior to that, France does not care. It's very important to keep that in mind because if you don't have any French income, you're going to tell me, but do I have to still file a return? Yes. If you have no income, you have to submit a null return. If you have no French source income, you still have to declare all of your non-French income into your French declaration. Being taxed, it's a different story, depending on the tax treaty between France and the country you're coming from, and many other criteria, you might or might not have to pay taxes. But at least to know that you have the obligation to comply with disclosing everything that you earn during the year worldwide. Another element.
Isaac, yes. Excuse me. Do you have slides that you're showing? Because we just see your screen with the little notes.
Okay, you see my screen with a little note. I apologize.
And the beach scene, yeah.
Yes, I apologize. Can you see that now?
Yeah. Yes.
I apologize. I'm sorry. I thought
thank you.
But thank you for pointing that out. Thank you very much. So just going back to the main slides, just to be sure everybody saw well, I just took you through it. Those are the 6 categories I was telling you about. Thank you for pointing that out. And the next item to keep in mind, as I said, is the disclosure of all of your non-French bank accounts. Very important. Anybody that lives in France or is a French tax resident should disclose all of its non-French bank accounts. It could be credit card, could be pension, IRA, 401k, 529s, for the US one, for example, ISA in the UK. All of those have to be declared and disclosed into the French declaration. If you don't do it, you will be fined 1,500 euros per account non-disclosed. I've had clients, unfortunately, especially in the international community, that have been exposed to, unfortunately, many fines and penalties because the tax authorities in France knew about small accounts, penny accounts they own or their parents or grandparents or acquaintances had on their behalf. Very important. All of that is related to the first triggering point, which is, are you a fiscal resident or not? If you're not, then all of that is not applicable to you. Moving along to the next thing, so tax liability, we talked about being resident or a non-resident. If you're a resident, obviously it's an entire household, which we call that quotient familial in French. The income tax, we talked about the worldwide income. We talked about the bank account disclosure, very important. Some of you have already owned or owning an apartment, a house. You've paid the occupancy tax, which is a tax foncière. And then the property, well, the opposite, sorry. There's a typo here. The property tax is the tax foncière if you own the house. And the next item is basically the tax d'habitation. Tax d'habitation is still applicable for some of us in France for second houses. Okay, so Macron government decided to remove that element because he believed that the tax d'habitation was unfair. So for the last 2 or 3 years, 80% of the population have not been subject to that tax. And if you are subject to that tax, you have to ask yourself the questions: am I communicating enough correctly to the tax authorities to know, so that they know I shouldn't be liable for the tax d'habitation? If it is your secondary home, then you will always have to pay occupancy tax, because the exception only kicks in for the primary home. Now, if you've had a secondary home for many years and now you just moved to France, you have to let the tax authorities know that you have now switched your secondary home to a primary home, so that you will not have to be subject to tax d'habitation. Wealth tax, we could have a webinar just on this. It's IFI in French, related to any assets, mainly real estate assets that you own more than 1.3 million net value. Okay, and the worldwide assets are included into this calculation after 5 years of you being in France. Okay, so you get an exemption for the first 5 years of any assets you own outside of France. For the non-resident, well, you pay taxes only on the French income. You still have property, occupancy, and wealth tax on the properties located in France. If you have any problem with sound or images and shares slides, let me know. Otherwise, I'll just move on. Double tax treaty, everybody talks about it. There's a lot of confusion around it. The language is on purpose very vague, broad, and sometimes very complicated to understand, but mainly covers personal income tax, corporate social contribution, capital gains. It does not cover the wealth tax and inheritance on purpose, because sometimes both countries want to have a share on your wealth and inheritance, and that's why we have those complicated rules. But yes, you should be applying the double tax treaty. And that is also the reason many people come to an accountant that has knowledge in France and in the UK or in the US or in Canada or wherever they're from, because there are consequences in both sides of the taxes, both sides of the ocean. Okay, so it's very important to understand there's a treaty between both countries. To give you again an idea of the tax deduction, which is the core, the nerve of all the tax liability, you should see here the main tax allowances and main tax credits that you should have. Obviously, tax allowances are good, but tax credits are better. Why? Because tax allowances are here to reduce your tax liability, as opposed to tax credit is a reduction of the tax owed. And if you don't owe any taxes, then you can get money back, a refund. Okay. Among that, you have obviously the tax preparation fees for Monceau CPA, as we are accredited professional for that matter. You have here a list of the main ones, but I'll go back to this later in more details, because for me, the nerves of the battle is here. So this basically sums up the first part that I wanted to share with you regarding what you need to know about taxes in general in France. The second element I want to share with you is, for me, the tax portal. Now, in France, like in the US, like in the UK, you have access to impot.gov.fr website. And then from there, you have access to all of your relevant information that the tax authorities know by you, your spouse, your kids, your house, what you own, what you don't own. You even have a copy of your tax bills from prior years. You have occupancy and property tax copies as well there. You have everything. And more importantly, you have a way to talk to the tax authorities in the fastest possible way called the Messagerie Sécurisée, secured inbox. That is also one of the reasons we as professionals ask you access to the tax portal, because we can talk to them on your behalf in the fastest way. Calling them or emailing them, given COVID, it has been very challenging. And don't talk to me about the tax period, which is going to start very soon. They're not responding. So the tax portal is the way to go. So you should all make sure you have access to the tax form. And you're going to ask me, how do I get access? Or if I do, what do I need to do? So the first thing we want to talk about is how do I gain access? So you could do your request in two ways. Either you could do it online, or you can do a paper request, which essentially is the same. Online requests might work or might not work depending on your identity documents and so on, but you should always try that first. And if it doesn't work, you should try to fill out Form 2043 and adding all the relevant documents that they're asking you. What are the documents usually? They are a copy of your passports, your carte de séjour, titre de séjour, French visa, and so on. Proof of residence or proof of domicile. So you have utility bill or phone bill and so on. And they need your RIB, which is your bank details. Why do they need that? If they owe you money, or if you owe money, then that would be the way for them to connect to your bank. So once you make that request, then you are being issued what we call an NF, numéro fiscal, which is the tax ID number for you and your spouse. Okay, so it's each of you have a different numéro fiscal. Obviously, once you do your first return, if you're married or taxed, then the tax authorities will link both accounts to one of you, which usually the man or the woman, whoever has done the tax declaration first. And you will see kind of a family tax portal access. In there, once you have the numéro fiscal, you can activate your access by putting in an account, create an account, putting your password or your phone number and so on. And then once you have the numéro fiscal and the access, that is indeed the best way to communicate with them. So we can resubmit documents, we can tell them how to interact with them and avoid potential errors and so on. So that is the most critical thing you need to be doing. Now, I want to everybody know and understand that if you don't have an numéro fiscal yet, you should ask it now. Why? Because once you are already launched with the tax season, which, as I said, going to start in February, March, they will not issue tax ID number anymore. They will tell you, once you submit your return, you will then add your 2043 form, which basically going to generate not only your tax return, but also your tax ID. You want to avoid that situation because you want to have a way to track everything beforehand, and also having the tax ID number will allow us to electronically file for you your return. If you don't do that, then you will have to do a paper for return. Okay, so that's also why, for me, it is the most critical item to make sure we have ASAP. Now, you can contact your local authorities, as I said, by the Messagerie Sécurisée. In there, it's very easy. You can, email them as many times as you want. They're usually pretty good at responding, and they respond pretty quickly. So you should definitely do that as much as you can. Regarding the walk-ins, you can go obviously to your tax office. You have the address where you belong based on your declaration of prior year taxes or on the tax bill you receive. You should go there if you need to, but you must be patient because of COVID and unfortunately what's probably going to happen in January and harder, difficult time due to the situation, and probably also given fiscal season, tax season coming up soon. I believe the walk-ins will be harder to get, but that's one of the options. But at least you should try to explore all of those possibilities to get you set up. Then a little bit about the calendar. So at least you understand how does it work. What needs to be done? Well, you gather your paperwork, to related income, let's say from year 2020. You go to online if you have access, if you need to fill out the forms yourself. A tax return can be filled out on your tax portal by yourself, should you know about it, okay? It's easy, but it's not that easy because you need to know where you're heading. And then online, there's tons of tools and guidance that you can get to better declare. A lot of people, what they do, they come to a tax preparer like us to get not only the job done, but to get also some advices. So those are the options that you have in terms of getting things set up. In terms of calendar itself, okay, night year end, it's the fiscal year end in 4 days. But the tax season starts in February, March, okay? But it really starts in April. Why? Because the tax authorities still working and are still working on 2020 tax returns now because they've had major delays and yet are updating their software, their forms and everything. So for us, tax preparer, for you guys, you have the first quarter of the year to really collect the data, set things up so that as soon as it's ready and it's open, usually it's mid-April or end April, you can then start submitting your return. You then have a month or two until May or June, depending on where you live. As you can see, you have some deadlines in the bottom of the page, or depending also of COVID. Last year, they just pushed off everything by a month. So who knows what's going to happen this year as well. In general, once the return is submitted, let's say May or June, whether it's electronically or through a tax preparer or by paper, the tax authorities process it over the summer. And in September, and again, I'm saying in theory, because that didn't happen this year because of COVID, myself, as a chartered accountant, I received my tax bill, my tax assessment last week. And a lot of people did as well. And still people are doing it and keeping it and getting it now. So that's what I'm saying. Theoretically, it should happen in September, October latest, where you receive your tax bill, your tax assessment, whether you owe money or don't owe money, but at least you get the final document. And then unlike in the US or in other countries, in France, you do the declaration first, and then you get the tax bill or the tax assessments a couple months later. That tax bill is the most important document that you need to have. The declaration is just a proof that you declared and everything's fine, but the tax bill shows that it was indeed processed and registered properly. Once that happened, you get a refund, as I said, or you have to pay. You can then have to pay monthly, quarterly, but you pass, which is the rate, the prélèvement à la source, which is the withholding taxes taken out from your paycheck or taken out from your bank account if you have non-salary income. Basically are then calculated and proposed and informed to you, so at least that you know. Once again, if you have access to the portal, you can then modulate, you can change the withholding rate, the pass rates, and you can communicate with them if there's an error or problem. But if you don't, things are harder, okay? So that is also why up until now, I covered everything around what you need to know about taxes in general in a very summarized way so that we can now move to the second part of our presentation. So the goal now is to show randomly what are the things you could do immediately in the next 4 days to optimize your taxes. And again, this is not a comprehensive list, but it is a good start, okay? So the first thing we talked about that I think everyone understands now is get a numéro fiscal. Get it as soon as possible, or at least launch the process as soon as possible. The second thing that you should be doing is sit down and review your 2020 tax return and look at it. Try to understand it by yourself or with the help of your accountant. What are the tax credits? What are the income? What are the things that I took advantage of in 2020 that I could potentially duplicate and use for 2021 and even more? Third one is service à la personne. It's called personal service. So it's a unique scenario in France where some services provided to taxpayers like you guys can be subject to 50% tax credit. Among them, you have the nanny, the maid, the kids' playground, the gardener, the IT guy, and obviously the accredited accounting firms such as Monceau CP. This is a global tax credit limited to 12,000 euros per year if you're single, 15,000 euros if you're married, and if you have children, it can go up to 18,000 euros. Everybody is allowed it. And remember the tax allowance versus the tax credit. Those are tax credit. And that's why I'm saying here, tax credit, and tax credit, because credit is what you will get money back. And we want everyone to have money back because nobody wants to pay a lot of taxes, right? So those are the things you could explore. And I'm giving you later sources of where you can see the comprehensive list of service à la personne and a lot of things. You see, I talked about the gardener. Some people mow their lawn themselves. Some people have a professional to do it. Well, just for you to know, 300 to 500 euros a year of that cost can fall into the service à la personne. And you have a problem with your computer. You don't know how to use Microsoft Office. You call a guy. That guy is licensed, accredited service à la personne. 300 euros, up to 300 euros there of him can be deducted in the service à la personne. An accountant is here to do your taxes, French, US, or UK, or anywhere else. But also we can prepare a business plan. We can help you with your problem with your bank, a loan, or any admin work. The actual name is assistance administrative. That means any admin work we do for you is subject to the service à la personne. We don't have a limit. For us, the credit can go up to the maximum. But at least you can see this is a great tool to really utilize. The next item, we have that everywhere, but in France it's very generous. If you make a donation to your non-for-profit organization, obviously registered in France, 20%, up to 20% of your revenue. So imagine someone makes 100,000 worth of revenue from real estate, from rental income, from salary, from micro enterprise, from company, whatever it is, 100K. He can theoretically give out up to 20,000 euros of that to non-for-profit organization. And in return, you get what we call a tax receipt called CERFA, which will allow you to get a deduction to 2/3 of the amount you pay. So imagine you pay 20,000 euros. In return, you're going to get 16,000 euros and some change of tax refund, tax deduction. 2/3 of the donations are basically taken out of your tax bill. Okay. And if you have from prior year balances that you could have not utilized, let's say last year, again, I made 100,000 euros, but I gave 30,000 euros to my church, to my temple, to my kids program, whatever it is. So I could only utilize 20,000 and the remaining 10,000, I could use it this year. Okay, so that's very important. And again, back to your second point, review your 2020 tax return, because all of those information are shown there. Now we're getting into a little bit more technical. There's a plan in France called Plan d'Épargne Retraite, PER. It's a private pension plan. You can open up to your insurance broker, your bank sometimes have it online, you can do it. And it's a private pension plan. You can contribute, like in the US, the IRA we have in the US, and the same thing in France. You have about a tax credit of 4,000 euros this year. So that means if you put 4,000 euros out of your own pocket, those 4,000 euros are deducted from your taxes. Okay, we're not talking about distributions now yet. When you're going to distribute yourself that money in 10, 15, 20, or 30 years, that's a different story. You may face taxes then, but at least you're taking advantage now of paying less taxes given those contributions you do to your private pension plan. Again, where do I get this information? I look at my last year's thresholds shown on my tax return. If it's not there, we can calculate that for you to tell you what's your limit for this year. Home improvement. So a lot of people do work at home. I want to emphasize that the work that you do has to be done by a professional with license RGE. If it's licensed RGE, then some of these amounts, usually 15 to 30%, can be used as a tax credit. Premium at charging station. A lot of people talk about e-cars, hybrid, electronic cars, whatever it is. You can install a dock system, a docking and charging station at home, at work, and for a couple, it's limited to 1,200 euros tax credit. So that's another great news. If you plan to save, the planet, that's another incentive the French government is doing. Another one, and I'm sure a lot of people are like, those are good stuff. I didn't know any of it. Well, I'm just giving you the best ones, but there's a full list, as you can see in the bottom. There's a link there. The next one, if you invest in a small French company, and again, I mean by small French company up to 50,000 euros. It's not my friend's boulangerie or my friend's pottery shop. There's a list of companies that you can invest within the FIP or FCPI. There, those are the names you need to look into it. Maybe you'll find your friend's business there, but those up to 25% of those investments can be tax deductible. So that could be a great way to invest money for the future as well. The next one is offset your gains with your losses. So if I have cryptocurrency, I have Bitcoins, I have stocks, I have bonds, then I made so much money this year and I have losses as well from a different type of currency or capital gains. I could offset one to the other. So you need to really review your portfolio before year end and decide what are the actions. Maybe you want to sell, maybe you want to buy back based on that tax tip that I'm giving you. If people, and a lot of people now are interested about real estate, then you have, again, great incentives in France. If you acquire a specific type of property, you have the dispositif, again, called Pinel. You have a scenario called Pinel, where you're allowed to deduct from your taxes up to a certain amount, 9, 10, 15%. They'll tell you how much you can deduct as amortization from your taxes. If you buy a house that is crappy and you improve it to then rent it to an area where there is shortage in rentals, then you can benefit from the de Normandie scenario. Same thing with a forest. If you buy a forest or trees or whatever around the forest, there are incentives for you to get some tax deduction from it. The last one is a new one that came out this year. If you basically subscribe to a press magazine, that is your first time you're doing it, that is an engagement that lasts more than 12 months. If it's a magazine that is published on a regular basis, then you can get 30% tax credit. Okay, so you get the point. Tax credit, that's what we want. Now, regarding your personal finances, what are the tips you need to keep in mind? Well, we talked about it. Contact your accountant to assess your nail situation. If you don't have one, come to us and we'll help you out. Make sure you have a copy and access of all your prior taxes. For example, if you change accountant or if you don't have one. French and international one. If you move from the US, from the UK, from Australia to France, you need to have access to all of those information. Ensure you have all the receipts and tax credits and revenues. We here at Monceau CPA we scan all of our documents. Why? Because we want to make sure that those documents are not, first of all, we try to avoid killing trees for nothing, paper for no reason. Second, digitalize everything so that you can retain a copy forever. Remember, if you have a tax audit, it won't happen tomorrow. It could happen in the next 3 years. I don't even know what's going to happen next week. So in 3 years, I would for sure have forgotten about anything about my tax accountant warned me about. If you have rental income, make sure you have the rent receipt, make sure you have the expenses, the tax you pay, property tax, for example. We talked about the access to the tax portal. Make sure you have access and all the info listed, the information listed there are correct. You can then modulate and change the pass rate, which we talked earlier there. I've had people telling me I made more money this year. I may have to pay more taxes when I submit my tax return. I want to change that now. I want to change my tax rate, my withholding tax rate. You can do that. You've had a birth in your family. You can tell them now. Those are the things you can do with the access to the tax portal. Documentation is essential. This is the key point here. You need to make sure you have access to all of the documents. I think I'm about to wrap up now what we covered and move on to the Q&A because I wanted to give 10, 15 minutes for the Q&A. But before we move to the Q&A, which I collected some questions, I just wanted, first of all, to thank you for taking the time to be here with us today. You can get a copy of this webinar by sending us an email. You have access to this email here, or you can look at us online. You can put also a nice comment on Google review or anywhere else, and we'll send you these slides with the recording. I also take advantage in advance to wish you a happy new year. And more importantly, for those that want to take a picture or will get the information later before we move on to the Q&A, those are my information in the two offices that I run in Paris and around Paris. You can see here some of the flags countries that we serve, among them, aside from the French one. I hope my English is okay for you guys. So we'll be very happy if you need help to be assisting you. Those are the basic information I wanted to share with you. And with no further ado, we're going to move to the Q&A. Before anyone asks any questions, I just want to address the question I received from one of the guys via email. Those questions are more around companies. I didn't cover much about company, but I'm going to still answer those questions because I think they may be related to anyone here with us. So yes, if you file in France, you have a company and you have a corporate tax return to file, and then you have a personal tax return to file. However, some corporations are pass-through entities, like you have in the US, an LLC, single member LLC. You don't file two returns, you file one return within your personal tax return. So that's exactly the same thing in France with the micro enterprise, for example. Okay, so if you have a micro enterprise, you don't file two separated tax return. You file one personal, and within there you declare your professional activity. For majority of the rest of statuses, such as SIS or SARL, you have to file two returns. Okay, and they're usually the same deadlines we talked about earlier. We talked about May, June for personal. Corporate are usually around April, May. Okay. Even if it's SASU, you are alone, unfortunately, you will have to file a return for the SASU. The expenses in general that your business is, well, think about it. Anything you purchase that is for the purpose of your business can be deducted. Obviously, if you are, I don't know, selling hats, for example, but you decide to buy a Mont Blanc pen at 1,000 euros, that expense will sound and will look weird, okay? So you have to understand that in terms of tax inspection, the inspector will look at, is the expense for the interest of the company or for the interest of the president or the owner of the company. So if you buy a phone, even if it's the newest iPhone, and you're going to use it for you, for sure, the majority of the time, it's easily showing that you use it for the business. If you go to same thing with your line, Orange mobile phone. If you go to a restaurant, that's important. You can go to a restaurant, but you have to be reasonable, not in terms of how much you're going to spend, for sure, but also in terms of how often you go to the restaurant and claim business expense for that. Make sure in the back of the receipt, you write who you had dinner with or lunch with, and what was the purpose of the meeting. Obviously, don't say what your wife or your boyfriend or your girlfriend. You could come up with whatever you want. But it's important that, again, documentation, that you document everything. Those are, in general, the questions regarding business expense. You could basically pretty much everything, so long as you keep that reasonable. Okay. I'm just going back to the. I'm going back to the chat because some of you have written their questions there. There's no different types of numéro fiscal. You can only have one numéro fiscal. If you were previously issued a numéro fiscal because you own a house, that numéro fiscal is usually the same you're going to keep. You just have to inform the tax authorities that that numéro fiscal that used to be treated as a non-resident is now a resident numéro fiscal, and you have to let them know about it. Okay. No, renovation and repairs cannot be service à la personne. Fortunately, no. Gardener and IT are usually the two things that we can relate to that. There's a long list, but those are the things we can have there. Well, what are good questions from Christine? What are the key things to keep in mind if this is the first time we will be filing taxes in France? Well, my advice to you is contact us or a good accountant and let them do the show while you enjoy a nice wine. But aside from the nice joke, you should really try to understand things for your own sake, because it's not easy. The bureaucracy in France is huge, but it's important that you also understand and educate yourself. Even though if you are outsourcing this task to somebody else, at least you understand how to do things. With my presentation, I think you've understood now, numéro fiscal, getting into the system, tax ID, and so on are the most important next first step to do. And then the rest should be fine if you follow the different advice that I've shared here. Maybe some of you have other questions. Perhaps some of you want to talk. I think, yes, I'm just trying to see here. Oops. Yeah, whoever wants to talk, I think you guys can. I think Francine, you wanted to talk. You had your hand raised.
Sure, I'll go first. So you mentioned that there's only one numéro fiscal. So I'm not a French resident yet, but my dad had properties in France, as you know, and when I looked at the avis, the tax avis, I have different numéro fiscales associated with tax d'habitation versus the tax foncière, and I just don't know how
Right.
I ended up. And now I have
Right.
my own numéro fiscal, which is different again.
Right. Well, you could look. I don't know how many years ago your dad activated or bought the house, but obviously now with more things computerized, maybe they're trying to delete and make a cleanup of all the doubles and triples they may have as numéro fiscal. Also, as I said, you need to reach out to them and tell them, now that I'm a resident of France, or you will be a resident of France, which numéro fiscal I need to use, because maybe those numéro fiscal belong to your father, to his heirs, and so on and so on. But theoretically, if you have been previously issued a numéro fiscal because you own a house, then you need to let them know that you move from the non-resident to resident status, and they'll keep the same. If for many reasons they decided to allocate a new one, that means there must have been a good reason because of the mix-up maybe that you mentioned. But generally speaking, we use the same numéro fiscal.
Okay, that helps a lot. Thank you.
My pleasure. I don't know if anybody else wants to talk, or if they have any questions or anything. I'll be happy to address and answer your questions. I guess I have responded to many of your questions. That's great. Well, if that's the case, I'm just going to wish you a happy new year. Enjoy the last few days of 2021. We're all hoping for a better 2022 on many different aspects, but more importantly on the health aspect. If you have any questions, any doubts, I know sometimes I'm late at responding. I usually tend to be fast, but I've been receiving a lot of emails. Feel free to reach out to me on WhatsApp, on emails, Facebook sometimes if I have time. I'll be delighted to answer your questions. Otherwise,
It
have
looks like some people sent in a few questions
Ah,
on your chat.
okay, thank you for that. I think I've addressed the Christine point, and thank you. Oh, yeah, John has asked a question about all income is sourced outside of France. Yes, I answered that question earlier. You have two things to keep in mind. The first one is all of your income located outside of France needs to be disclosed for compliance purposes. That is a requirement. And is it taxed? It all depends on the tax treaty between France and the country the money is coming from. In general, again, general quotation mark, if the income is already subject to taxes, let's say in the US, you won't have taxes in France as well. However, it's not always true because in France, to make things more complicated, you have two types of taxes. You have the regular income tax, and you have what they call the social charges that are CSG and CRDS, okay? And sometimes you may not be liable to the tax element because France will consider that you've already paid taxes in the US, but they'll assess you social charges of 17.2% in France. Okay, but the good news, we talked about the US. In the US, you may have to pay in France here the social charges, but you get a tax credit back onto your US taxes so that it's a global wash between France and the US. Okay, another great reason why you should come to an international accountant because you need to play in both hands for that matter. I hope, John, have answered your question.
I have one more question.
Sure.
If you don't mind.
You're the brave one to talk orally and ask orally your question. So for sure, anybody else also, but for sure, I'll answer your question, Francine.
So, yeah, so last time I attended one of these, you said that husband and wife can be, one could be a tax resident and one could be a non-tax resident. If you do that, does that, and in France, my understanding is you always file jointly and when you're married, but in the United States, you can file separately.
Yeah.
So
Right,
how would that work if one is a tax resident and one is not a tax resident, both in the France and the?
It's a good question, and you could do two things. Either your spouse can appear on your taxes in France, even though he has no ties with France. So we'll tell the tax authorities he's my husband, but he works and lives elsewhere and does not meet the fiscal residency requirements rule. That is perfectly fine. It's actually beneficial because you are basically getting his standard deduction to your tax return. You can also elect not to have him at all, but still say I'm married, but my husband is a non-resident and it's not here. So you can do both, similar to what you do in the US.
But you have to recognize his income if you get a deduction, or you just get a deduction?
Well, no, you get a deduction. You get a deduction with nothing. Correct. So you get the marital status, which is great, but his income, because he's a non-resident, is not included into the tax return.
Wow, that's good. That sounds like too good to be true.
Well, I'm just not the party pooper, but just letting you know that in France, the tax deduction or the standard deduction is not as high as we have in the US. So it's not having a great tax impact.
Right. Okay. And then in the US, do you have to file separately or can you do it together?
Well, if you're married, you have to file together, and to file separately or head of household, you have to meet certain requirements. The majority of the case, for example, if I have a spouse who is not an American citizen, a green card holder, then the person in the US can file single head of household. And those we determine the statuses based on the assumptions. And as I said earlier, every situation might be different.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, it is best to file US first and then French taxes or do an extension. Okay, another great question. I think I have answered that question in one of my webinars. It comes always back. First of all, deadlines in the US and France are about the same. We talked about April 15th in the US, we talked about May, June in France. But as you are an expat from the US, you are given an automatic extension to June 15 deadline. So right there, you are meeting already the French deadlines, okay? The way we do it, because I have a US and a French tax team working both for me, we prepare the tax return in France, and then we send the draft version to the US, so he can include there for the foreign earned income exclusion credit, for example. Then we prepare the US taxes inclusive of the French taxes, and then go back to the French tax return now to see if there are consequences from coming from the US into the French taxes. And then we kind of review both of them together, submit that to the client for review, and then submit to the relevant authorities. That is in the ideal world. However, in the US, many of the times you can't file everything on time because you don't have access to all the relevant information. For example, if you have a K1 or if you have shares from the companies and so on, sometimes the companies will take longer to issue the related information to you so that you can only get information over the summer. So what people do in the US, we file an extension. We pay the relevant taxes that we estimate, and we submit the return in October 15 deadline. In France, unfortunately, you don't have an extension system. So what we do is we submit the return in France to the best of our knowledge in June, for example, and then we can revisit the tax return until December 15. So there is no harm to submit a first version, maybe even be assessed something correct or incorrect, and then revise that by sending an amended tax return before December 15th, which at that time, the US return will have been completely done. Okay. I will take the last question if there is any. Okay. Well, thank you very much once again for your time. And we'll be looking for more webinars of those next year. And again, Happy New Year and talk to you very soon. Bye-bye.